Welcome to Machine Minds, where technology and humanity meet. I'm your host, Greg Terrusian, founder of Samson Rose, a recruiting and search business focused on the robotics and AI industries. The Machine Minds show is where we dive deep into the intricate world of robotics and artificial intelligence. As a staffing industry leader with a passion for the frontiers of technology, I'm pleased to be bringing you intimate conversations with the founders, investors, and trailblazers who are at the heart of the AI and robotics revolution. In each episode, we dig into their journeys, the applications of the products they're working on, and the breakthroughs that are shaping our future. Join us as we explore how these machine minds are transforming the way we live, work, and understand our world. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a tech enthusiast, or just curious about this amazing field, you'll learn something new with each episode. Let's delve into the extraordinary. Let's delve into Machine Minds. Hello and welcome to the Machine Minds show. I'm your host, Greg Terrusian, founder of Samson Rose, a robotics and AI focused search firm. And on today's episode, we are joined by Rajat Bhageria, founder and CEO of Chef Robotics. And from the name, you can probably guess that they are in the food tech space. Thanks for being here today, Rajat.
Thank you, Greg, for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Let's jump into it. So as always, I start by handing it over to the guest to give us a bit of background. So can you share a bit about your background, what led you into the field of robotics and AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, my dad's side is all basically a bunch of engineers, and my mom's side has a lot more business people. So I think growing up, I always knew that I was excited by the intersection of business and technology. So, that led actually to me in high school doing some work in like more science and research. Actually, but I did some independent research and actually even got the first author paper published. But I just found that the pace was not very exciting for me personally. So I steered more towards engineering. So undergrad, I went to Penn and studied computer science and economics in Wharton, but really focused on engineering because science, what I found in high school, was a little bit slower pace than I'd like. And ended up also doing a master's in machine learning and robotics after that. And my first kind of foray into this whole thing was in college. I worked on a company called Third Eye, where we basically use computer vision to recognize what's in front of you and then verbally tell you what it is. The idea of kind of helping empower visually impaired people by recognizing what's in front of them.
Nice.
So we worked on actually this company for 3.5 years or so, and actually had a small exit after that. And I think it really opened my eyes to the power of essentially AI and computer vision. Whereas before, what I was used to when you think about software, it's purely in the cloud. And if you want to get information about the physical world, like, okay, where is something? Where's an object? You have to it's really hard. I mean, computer vision was very novel and very new, but suddenly a camera, this sensor that's it's kind of everywhere now, can make sense of the world. And then, of course, once you get data about the world into your computer, you can do stuff with it. So it was kind of this realization that this computer vision thing is really, really powerful and exciting. And my next question is, okay, great. I think AI is going to be one of the most powerful technologies. I think, of course, many people agree with that. What wasn't clear is, where do I focus it? Do I focus on more of a cloud-based system like LLM, for example, or do I do something in the physical world? And around that, I was just reading a lot of different stuff. And what I kind of stumbled upon is a very simple idea, which is 90% of global GDP is in the physical world. It's not in the cloud, if you will, right? And so it's in things like transportation, shipping, food, manufacturing, etc. Right? These very physical world and industries. And so I became pretty convinced that actually probably the biggest impact for AI is going to be on the physical world, which of course very naturally leads its way to robotics. So that's kind of a short introduction on kind of how I stumbled upon robotics.
Amazing. That's great. Yeah. And I'm glad that you touched on the GDP there and everything like that, because a lot of people, from the investment landscape, but then, and also I guess the general public, they always think, the biggest money to be spent is in software, and everyone uses, especially these days, you got your phone, everything's connected, your computer, that's what everyone relates to. But you forget that the physical world is really where the bulk of the capital goes, and generation of income and wealth and capital, right?
Yes.
So,
and then even one step further beyond that, which is I mean, 90% plus of the GDP is in the physical world, and then within that, like 50% of all GDP goes to labor, right? It's people.
Mm.
So like, literally, like when people say like, oh, the shipping industry is really big. It is, but actually, the biggest industry on planet Earth is the labor market, right? There's just no exceptions to that, right? And so I think that's really fascinating. And of course, what we
Yeah.
all know is that like generationally, labor is getting harder and harder to come by. People don't want to do the jobs. I mean, they're getting older. It's all the different stats we know about.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think a theme that we've talked about, we spoke a bit about this offline, but some of the themes that have been coming up in the show, but one of them very much so is the labor market, right? The shortage there. And just as the generations continue to get older and, the newer generations don't want to be doing anything that's labor intensive, and shying away from it, or if it's dangerous. And obviously you guys are in the food tech space, whether it's food prep or around heat or anything that's repetitive, monotonous, whatever, it's getting increasingly harder to staff. So products like what you guys are building is imperative for us to continue production.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you, you've obviously been involved in several ventures prior to Chef Robotics as well. How have those experiences shaped your approach to entrepreneurship and technology and what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I think my first kind of real company was Third Eye, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Third Eye, like I alluded to, kind of introduced me to the power of AI. And after this, I knew that I wanted to do something in AI plus the physical world, like embodied AI, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know exactly what company to start. And one of my close friends was starting his own venture fund. So we decided to kind of build prototype capital together, which was essentially this idea that, okay, well, the same idea, right? The biggest industries to disrupt are probably these older industries, traditional industries, foundational industries. Okay, well, where are those founders lying? Well, who has domain level expertise? Well, it's probably not some Stanford grad or Harvard grad who lives in the Bay Area or New York, right? If you really believe that you need some kind of insight and proprietary data stream, right, which is also really important to AI, of course, you might be, for example, in the food industry in Solon, Ohio. Or if you do concrete production, you might be in Atlanta. So anyways, we had this belief that a lot of the people who have really good insights about problems to be solved, right? Not just like the technologies, but the deep problem to be solved and also the proprietary data streams, they would be everywhere around the country. And thus, okay, how do we get access to those founders? Well, we find their friends. And if we can find founders' friends who are also founders and get them on as scouts for us, then we can get access to those people. So that was kind of what Prototype Capital was. And I think it really allowed me to kind of talk to a lot of people in the industry, not only in the physical world industries outside of food, but also the food industry. And it kind of led very naturally to understanding that, okay, well, one of the biggest industries on planet Earth is the food industry. Actually, in particular, it's the fourth biggest labor market in the US. And you might be wondering, okay, why work on the fourth biggest? Why not work on the first biggest? Well, the first biggest is actually truck driving. And I think I studied enough companies in truck driving to know that's a really technically hard problem. Some would even argue that it's harder than city driving autonomous vehicles. So I decided not to do that. It's obviously a very big market, but it's technically super tough. So I decided not to do that. The second biggest market I kind of look into was retail and retail automation, things like inventory and things like that, tracking. And I think in that industry, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has actually been solved already. Things like barcode scanners, things like autonomous checkout, things like self-checkout. What's left is actually really tough. So also decided to say no to that. Technically tough, to be clear. And then the third industry is nursing aides. That's really tough too. I mean, people in Japan, there's a few companies out there that are doing some good work there, but there's been a slew of failures in kind of like personal assistant robots that kind of informed that, okay, maybe this is not, we're not super good at, the usability aspects of robots just yet. But the fourth one is the food industry. So that's kind of like, I was like, okay, well, there's obviously a big giant market. I know that it seems tractable for AI today. It doesn't seem so complex, like level 5 autonomy for self-driving cars. So it felt like a really good market to kind of get started in. So that's kind of the progression from Third Eye to Prototype to the inklings of Chef.
Love that. Transitioning from your idea to execution is always a challenge many entrepreneurs face. Can you talk about some of like those pivotal moments in whether it was your career or even with Chef that really helped you build this foundation for what you're doing right now?
Yeah. I think probably the most important that I can comment on is, what I find in robotics is, I think a lot of people I've seen built a product that basically nobody wants. And I think that's usually driven by robotics is a technically really tough field. It requires it's an intersection of mechatronics and computer vision and AI and motion planning control. I mean, and then of course, manufacturing, supply chain, deployments, customer support. I mean, there's so many different facets to this. So you end up getting these very technical founders who are super smart. And of course, what they know how to do well, their hammer, if you will, is to build stuff. And so they end up just building stuff. Kind of like the Eric Ries's lean startup model, which says if you were to build pure software, if I were to build a web app, then you build a prototype, an MVP is what do you call it? You get customer feedback and then you iterate. So this iterative approach is tried and true. It works for pure software. And then you have these very technical founders whose first instinct is to build stuff. So you end up having a bunch of founders who just want to build stuff. And they end up building something nobody wants because the iteration loop for robotics is substantially slower than a web app or a SaaS company. So I think probably the most pivotal moment for us and for me as an individual, as a founder, is this idea of kind of selling the product before building it. And, what we essentially did is we came in with an open book. We said, look, we believe that the food industry is big. We believe that there is a problem to be solved. We looked at the data. The BLS reports that there's 1.13 million jobs unfilled in 2023. We know it's a big problem. Robots can help here. So we believe there's some opportunity. We don't know what that looks like. What does the product look like? What does the solution look like? We don't know. Mm-hmm. We just talked to a lot of people in the food industry. Everyone from food truck operators to restaurant operators to food production operators, etc. What's your biggest problems? And of course, they echoed this sentiment that, okay, well, it's labor shortage. But then we kept on thinking, okay, well, where can robots help within your operation? And we learned, okay, well, they can help in the plating and assembly operation, which is this idea of kind of taking pre-cut and pre-cooked food and assembling it. That's actually a lot more labor intensive than cooking or prepping, is what we learned. Prepping as in cutting things and cooking as in cooking. So we said, okay, assembly is the biggest place to help. And then we dug more about, okay, what specific product details, right? What does it look like? What rates does it need to do, et cetera. And we basically had them define our product requirements. I mean, and then of course we repeated this for 10 customers to really make sure that we weren't over-indexing in any one customer. But they basically give us a PRD. Here's what you need to build. And then once we had that, we went back to them and said, okay, look, we'll build you this. To build you this, we really need a firm commitment that if we were indeed to be able to give you this exact thing you asked for, you would pay us this amount of money. And we've done an ROI to make sure that this ROI, this price we're going to charge you is worth your while.
Right.
And just to further reduce your risk, we're going to ask you for a deposit, or we'll return the deposit if we don't meet some kind of site acceptance test. And that site acceptance test, dear customer, is defined by you. It's going to be this and this and this and this. If we can meet those kind of requirements, then will you pay us, right? And so that was really nice because before we had built anything, before we had raised any venture capital, before we had gotten any engineers, we had a clear PRD of what exactly the customer wants, and we had customers.
That's amazing.
And now you just got to build the thing. And the technical risk is not, it's not easy to come by, but I had a robotics background. I know this was possible.
Right.
I know it's not like L4, L5 autonomy hard as an AV. So it felt tractable and doable. And that's probably the biggest thing that I see a lot of founders mess up in SaaS and consumer, but especially in robotics, because the iteration loops are slow and this kind of lean startup approach doesn't really work. Instead of iterating, you kind of just have to jump to the right solution a little bit on the product level, not on the engineering level, but what are we building level.
It's very smart. That is a very smart approach. I'm curious, what sort of timeline did you have from getting that agreement to actually delivering the prototype or even the first milestone?
Yes.
Well, because you didn't even have an engineering team. So. Yes. No, totally. And there's so many layers there, right? So yes, I mean, as soon as we got those, part of the reason I wanted to get those contracts, to be honest with you, is
I wanted to build conviction for myself. Like I was like, okay, look, I have an opportunity cost here. You know, if I'm going to spend 10 years of my life, I want to make sure it's going to like have a high probability of work. And the number one reason I know startups don't work is people don't want it. So, once I got the contracts, I was able to be like, okay, look, I believe in it. At that point, we raised our first bit of capital, a pre-seed round led by Perkins. So that process took like a month and a half. Once we got capital, then of course hiring is really hard. Actually, hiring is much harder than fundraising. You know this very well.
Oh yeah.
especially at the time. Look, we're asking these like super senior people who are making a ton of money at top firms in Silicon Valley to take like and giving them like 30% of their pay or 50% of what they were making, in return for lots of equity, of course.
But they're taking a bet, right?
They're taking a bet. So there's a lot of people who are just like, look, I have a partner, I have kids, like I can't. And then there's other people who are willing to do it, but then they weren't as senior as we'd like. So hiring actually took quite a while, and of course, getting the very first senior engineer is super tough because I think Derek Sivers is the person who says like a solo founder, you're the sole person is kind of like a lone nut, but as soon as you have your first follower, you're a leader, right? So the first person is really tough. But once we had the first person, we were able to get a good team of 4 or 5 people. That process took 3 to 4 months.
Nice.
And then, I think in terms of the engineering, like, after we kind of had our office and some of the early hardware, like, I think like we tried to take a very iterative approach, right? Like, which is to say, like, let's not try to build to production day one. Let's kind of get an MVP. And we set a pretty ambitious goal for that. We want an MVP that kind of fully does what it needs to do in 2 months. And we were able to meet that. We actually shipped the MVP, which was nothing food safe or anything, to a customer site and got some early feedback. But of course, then like making an MVP into a prototype into production, high volume production, in terms of just the reliability is tough. So that's just an ongoing process, and that's what we've been on the last couple of years.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, you covered a lot of what I wanted to ask you about the actual founding of Chef here, what need you really saw in the market, and really the market gave you the need right there and there, didn't they? And then also walking us through some of those early days, and your approach is pretty unique. And I've seen it myself, companies that want to work in stealth mode because they want to hold their cards really close to their chest. They don't want anyone to know they work in stealth mode, and then they come out to market and no one wants it. Someone's beaten them to market, they're too expensive, whatever it is, they completely missed the target and wasted all of that time and energy and capital. I did want to ask some of the biggest hurdles. You've kind of touched a little bit on how you've got this traction, and then the staffing side of it, the hiring side. But were there any other major hurdles that you had early on, and how did you overcome those?
I mean, there's hurdles every day. I mean, that's the life of a startup founder is like hurdles every day.
Yep.
And I think there's quite a few, honestly, right? Hiring is honestly pretty tough. And what I will say is like, I purposely decided to take, usually what most people do when it comes to hiring is they hire their friends, right? I could have done that. But, I was fairly young at the time. I had a lot of really smart friends, but they weren't super experienced. I made the decision of saying, okay, well, let's get people who have been in the industry 7-8 years, who failed, maybe have some scar tissue, maybe succeed a little bit. But of course, that's harder because I don't have a network. So it's a lot of outbound. It's a lot of like hunting, right, if you will. And then what's also hard, of course, is they're making a lot more money. So I think like hiring has definitely not been easy. What I will say is that like, it's honestly, it's a bit of just like a hustle game. You got to just grind until you get your first few people. But once you get your first few really strong people, really good engineers attract other really good engineers, right? So I think that was definitely a good learning and definitely a big hurdle. I think another thing I will say is like, Elon Musk talks about this all the time, but like prototypes are easy, production is hard. I mean, of course, like for him, it's talking about manufacturing, but I think that same thing applies for Chef, right? We're dealing with food, and a lot of people in the industry, they might look at Chef and be like, oh, it's simple, and on the surface, it is quite simple actually. But the thing with food is, and this is an example, it kind of speaks to this how production is like. The thing with food is that it varies literally hourly. In other words, like let's just take an onion, and if you julienne the onion into like rings, that's a pretty different material than if you chop the onion. And if you chop the onion into 1/4 inch cuts, that's very different than 1/2 inch cuts. And if Sally does it, that's a little bit different than Bob. And sweet cream number 1 is going to be a little bit different than sweet cream number 2. And depending on how you grow the ingredients, it's going to be different. And if you cook it for another 5 minutes, a little bit different than 3 minutes. You get the point. It's like this infinitely variable material. And now you need to build this like AI-enabled robot that can manipulate that thing consistently, reliably, without spilling it, without damaging it, place it in the right compartments daily, and do millions of cycles of that. Right. So getting a little demo video to be able to pick onions, trivial. I mean, you could literally put that together in like a couple months, as I called out. But getting that to be production grade, that it works not only with any kind of onion, but now no matter how you cook it or cut it or etc., but also millions of other ingredients, and then do tens of millions of cycles. That's really, 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 really tough, actually. But that's also what makes it production grade and work with enterprise customers. That's what's great as moat. So I think that is something that I think a lot of people don't see, but I think that's probably one of the hardest parts when it comes to robotics.
Definitely. Yeah, you at the end of the day, you need to produce something that people are going to be willing to pay you for, and that's going to stand the test of time. And having it, like you say, to do a demo, we're seeing that a lot right now with some of the, I don't want to name any companies or anything like that, but that have really cool demo videos and creating a lot of buzz and clicks and shares and everything like that. But when it comes to real world, there's still a lot of question marks around them being sufficient for that. So.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think like the way I think about it is like, there's this like idea of like breaking particular hurdles that inspire people. So like, for a while, for example, the world did not believe a 4-minute mile was possible until somebody did it. And then there's a bunch of people who did 4-minute miles. I remember like in direct to consumer, right? Warby Parker kind of did this, right? People didn't really believe this whole this like direct to consumer idea. People used to go to retailers, and then Warby Parker came around and said, okay, we're going to kind of, do this direct to consumer thing. And it, of course, worked really well until recently where customer acquisition costs are through the roof. But I think the point I'm making is I think in robotics, there hasn't been that like ChatGPT moment, right? If you will, right? Like what we're seeing in pure AI, right? Like software-based, cloud-based AI is the day-to-day consumer. You go to a random part of the country, people are talking about AI. It's like on the top of everyone's mind. But I truly believe that way bigger than LLMs and kind of cloud-based AI is physical world AI, embodied AI. I mean, it's just a much bigger market, just practically. For sure. But to do that, there needs to be a success story, right? There needs to be somebody that says, hey, look, we've done it, right? And we've massively succeeded. And I think in robotics, it's very common, like you said, like people chase demos and like cool videos. So I think we're really trying hard to like really deploy true production grade robots. True production grade robots have a lot of recurring revenue, just have a really good business that's actually solving customer pain points, that's actually really helping. And hopefully, if we do this right, we can say, okay, look, here's a success story. Chef did it. We helped really bring AI and robotics to the food industry and helped overcome this labor shortage and help with yield and all these things that we're working towards. And then somebody else, another founder, another engineer, another operator can say, okay, well, let me do the same for construction. Let me do the same for hospitality. Let me do the same for the medical industry, et cetera.
It's the ripple effect. Yeah. Yeah. And not only that, you're going to get the investment side as well to say, oh, well, it's worked there. Let's replicate that in this other industry, or they've got more faith in it. I think that's been one of the biggest bottlenecks. And obviously you guys have gone through it as well over the last few years. Fundraising, there's two things, right? Hiring, which you touched on, which I'd love to get back to in a second. And then the fundraising side, because capital intensive projects with hardware have been scaring more investors than not. So until someone does it, and then obviously everyone wants to follow suit, like we're seeing right now with AI, it's the new shiny thing and people don't want to miss out. So they're just deploying capital like crazy. But next will be robotics to have that ChatGPT moment, which hopefully is this year. We shall see. And I'm glad that you touched on the hiring side of it, because I have these conversations all the time with early stage founders. It's really tough, and you have the want and need for a senior engineer or someone to lead the engineering department. Obviously, you can't compete on comp, whether it's base or total package with bonus, and no one's matching 401ks in a Series A startup, right? But if you want that seniority, there's also the reflection of, well, what does that mean for that individual? And that means they're probably at a certain stage in life where they maybe they're the breadwinner, or maybe they have kids in school, or they have all of these other expenses and mortgage where it's tough to take a considerable pay cut. And sometimes they want to trade off equity with cash. And then the founders have the battle of, well, we want someone with conviction in the company, so we need them to take equity. And it's just a whole, song and dance. And you can probably attest to it as well. If you're hiring by yourself as a sole founder, it can be a full-time job. It's really tough to pound the pavement virtually, right? Headhunting, outreaching, having tons of conversations and trying to sell the dream while build and run a company. It's pretty difficult.
It is, yeah.
Let's switch gears here and talk more about your product. I'd love to dive into the technology behind Chef. And I know you can't share everything because you guys have your niche, and I totally respect that. But can you tell us what sets you apart from other solutions on the market, and what your technology really does?
Yeah. So I think the way I think about our core technology is we are basically building an AI engine for food manipulation. We call this Chef OS colloquially, of course. But that's basically the way you can think about it. Is that, as I alluded to, food is extremely highly dimensional. No matter how you cut it, how you cook it, who cooks it, etc. It's extremely variable. So a human can manipulate all of that. A human can go from manipulating a bunch of different ingredients from Thai cuisine to Indian cuisine to Mexican cuisine trivially. But that's because they have a few components. They have eyes to make sense of the world, right? They have a brain, of course, they have intelligence. They have an arm, and they have different utensils. And this basically, these set of things, these four ideas, right? Eyes, intelligence, arms for motions, and then utensil, they allow you to manipulate basically different ingredients. And humans are really good at that. So we're trying to say, okay, well, if we'd like to be able to offer a human equivalent to be able to allow our customers to kind of overcome this labor shortage, well, we need to have our software layer be extremely flexible, right? And so I think that's the crux of the product. How do we go from manipulating diced chicken to a sauce to ice cream to cheese grits, right? Flexibly without a ton of different hardware changes. That's the crux of the technology we're building. How is it differentiated? Well, I think the biggest way I think it's differentiated is we took a slightly different product architecture than many other food robotics companies. I think many food robotics companies took this approach of dispensers. And by the way, dispensers have been around in the industry for 40 or 50 years. If you look at food manufacturing, you have a lot of different kinds of dispensers. You have pneumatic dispensers that kind of fill a cavity and then push it out. You have vibratory feeds that vibrate the food out. You have augers that kind of spin. You have screw denesters. You have multi-head dispensers. There's lots of different dispensing technologies out there that honestly have been around for 100 years. Even those food manufacturers sometimes do production by hand. Why is that? Well, the dispensers are not flexible. Well, that tells you something, right? This technology has been around for 50, 100 years, but even the manufacturing guys don't use those dispensers all the time. So the crux of it is that hardware-based dispensers are hardware, right? It's a non-flexible system. It's a machine that just does the same thing over and over again. A machine works really well if I work at Ford and I'm putting doors onto my F-150. It's the same door onto the same F-150 over and over and over again. Or if I'm putting a cap onto my 2-liter bottle of Coke, or if I'm putting the Gorilla Glass into my iPhone, it's the same over and over again. That a machine can do. But if I'm dealing with food, even the same ingredient is different every single day because there's a different cook that comes in and cooks it. The same cook adds a little bit too much oil accidentally. That's really hard for a dispenser or a machine because it's just not flexible. It doesn't have any sensors to kind of get data in. It doesn't have intelligence to make decisions. And as a result, it can't deal with those variances. So I think our approach is to say, instead of doing more like gravity-fed dispensing, let's do more of a pick-and-place based AI-based solution. That is honestly more off-the-shelf hardware. And really, it's more of an AI and software company. If you look at our team, it's 95% computer vision, robotic software. It's more robotics as in software engineering as opposed to hardware engineering. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we're trying to do a little bit differently than others.
Interesting. Yeah. I've also been speaking to VCs and even people on the commercial side within some of these robotics companies that they're like, we're more looking at companies or business plans, revenue streams that are more in a more favorable way that lean heavier on software, even though they're hardware companies, right? Even though they're robotics, but whether they've got a SaaS play or the team is built up or the product is built up more so there, we can't get away from hardware. Obviously, we love hardware. That's what we want to do and what we're providing. But when you think about like reoccurring revenue or even the dependency on the product, software is still where people tend to favor.
Yeah. Well, and it makes a lot of sense, right? I think it's easy to like just diss VCs, and I think that's not totally fair. Like, why do they think that way, right? I think there's a couple parts of it. There's the technology side, and then there's the economic side. So on the technology side, I mean, we talked about how like hardware iteration loops are slow, and even autonomy iteration loops are slow. I mean, if you look at like even the best kind of like AV companies or autonomy companies, it's just slow to do autonomy. So hardware, throwing another bit on top of that, which is hardware iteration loops, it just makes things slower, which means instead of like 5 shots on goal with a seed round, let's say, to kind of get some early inklings of product market fit, you have like 1 shot on goal. You got to get it right perfectly, which is just hard from the technology perspective. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And then the second part of it from the technology perspective is like, it's just not as flexible. I mean, like if you want to build a general purpose robot, hardware is not going to do it. Hardware has been around. It's actually one of the oldest technologies on planet Earth. I mean, we've been building hardware for millennia. Like, humans are actually pretty good at it. It's just not super flexible. And then from the business model perspective, as you called out, we do want recurring revenue. I mean, recurring revenue is really important to have good gross margins, good flow, and also just like it brings some predictability into your accounting. So like it's hard to have recurring revenue when you have mostly a CapEx or hardware-based solution. Whereas if you have more of a software-based solution, you can offer things like, hey, we're going to upgrade your software every so often. We're going to show you improvements when it comes to like the core consistency or core ingredient coverage like we might provide. And that makes our customers more willing to pay us recurring software margins and also fees, which of course is better for our business, but also makes investors happy.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Sustainability is obviously a significant concern in food production, food industry in general. How does Chef Robotics contribute to that, creating a more sustainable food industry?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple parts to this. So one of the main parts is that if you think about any food companies, whether a food truck or a food manufacturing company, everything in between, 40 to 50% of your COGS, your cost of goods sold, is raw materials, right? And the way the food industry works is it's, the production managers in the food industry, they usually are telling their line leads to over portion. In other words, put a little bit too much food. Because if you're the end consumer, you'd rather get a little bit extra avocado than less avocado. Makes sense. Okay, well, what does that mean though? Well, there's this term in the industry called giveaway. Giveaway is basically like, I wanted 2 ounces, but on average, my line workers will put 2.2 ounces. And of course, if you do enough trays, and again, this is from the small guys to the really big guys, it's quite expensive. It's expensive for them from the bottom line perspective, but of course, it's also really not good for our planet because in aggregate across the country and across the world, maybe consumers are happy, but it's actually leading to a lot of food waste. So I think one of the things that Chef is really good at is actually reducing that giveaway and by extension, actually reducing food waste. And this is actually really, really important for things like proteins, right? Where like there's a lot of methane that comes with that. And also it's just expensive. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody to kind of keep that at bay and at par. That's probably the biggest thing. Yeah, it's consistency. The other one that's less sustainability, but I think important nonetheless for like the country more existentially is this idea that many food companies are having a really, really tough time hiring. So what have other industries done to solve that? Well, you can increase wages a little bit. That actually sometimes doesn't help because the conditions are so bad that even a higher wage doesn't help. So what many other industries like manufacturing have done, is like pure manufacturing, like they're making iPhones, they go to China, they go to Southeast Asia. they go to Mexico, etc. Well, that works great for those industries. But as we've learned in COVID, as we've learned with the war in Ukraine and other conflicts right now, it's not great for any country to be dependent on an external state for something very basic. Like Europe is learning this with oil right now, with the Ukraine war. So I think like it would be not good for the United States to depend on foreign jurisdictions when it comes to their food supply chain. So I think one of the things that's really exciting for our team and us is that if we do this right, at scale, of course, we're not big enough to merely have this impact just yet, but at scale, hopefully we can actually help more and more of the food supply chain stay onshore in the United States, and by extension, help keep the food supply chain very secure and kind of not dependent on foreign states.
Huge impact. Definitely. Well, hopefully you get there. Yeah. Starting a robotics company is obviously no small feat. You guys are doing great. I want to congratulate you. Take a moment to do that. You guys had some amazing milestones. Anyone that's been following the space or your company has probably seen that you guys passed the 10 million meals milestone recently. And then I know what you wanted to talk about, but the Andreessen Horowitz, the American Dynamicism, if I'm saying that right, 50 list as well, making that. Can we talk about those two?
Yeah, the 10 million meals mark is honestly like a really good win for our team. It's a really big win for our team. Like I said, production is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think it's a really awesome milestone because I actually don't think like anyone in food robotics has come anywhere close to that. And really that's because I think like not building the right thing from the get-go, and then like even if you build the right thing, can you get it to be production grade and scale it? So what we have done to really hit that milestone is a few things, right? Really make sure we solve our customer problem. Like that, it sounds so fundamental, but like extreme amounts of customer centricity. And then also like really focus on customer success. And what I mean by that is like, you know, our customers tend to be pretty big. They're enterprise customers. So they can buy hundreds of robots at scale. But to do that, what needs to happen? The previous robot needs to be utilized. If you think about a robot like as a human employee, you're not going to hire another employee if your last employee is like only 50% utilized.
Yeah.
So utilization is really important because, you know, if I can demonstrate that, okay, customer, you have 6 of our robots, and those 6 robots are utilized like 80% of the time. Like you guys just use them. You love them. They're adding value. Well, that increases the amount of value adding to the customer. That of course brings our reliability up, but also the customer is going to now buy more robots. And so if I can grow kind of the core, if I can make the core product better and reliable, then they're going to use it more. If they use it more, that drives up utilization. If they have more utilization, they're going to buy more robots. And if they buy more robots, now I have a really good case study. And if I have a case study, I can get new customers. If I have new customers, I can get more funding. And if I get more funding, I get more great engineers. When I get more good engineers, I make the core product better, which gets more usability, more utilization. You get the point. So yep. I think that's flywheel. A testament to that whole flywheel that we're building there. Our company is extremely kind of customer centric. Like let's not do a ton of things. Let's do one thing, but do it really freaking well. And I think that's a reflection of that. 10 million meals is a reflection of that working.
That's amazing. And then making the list.
The list kind of came out of the blue. Actually, it was a pleasant surprise.
Really?
Yeah. But I think I think it kind of highlights like, you know, one thing that's cool is that like, you know, there's a lot of like pretty like big name brand companies on that list, like Databricks and others. So it's pretty cool to see us on it for sure. But I think it highlights like, it's real. Like it's not like a toy anymore. Chef is a production grade company. We're helping enterprise customers. We're scaling. It's real, and I think that's a good feeling. And hopefully, you know, to that comment about keeping American kind of food supply chain onshore, hopefully at scale we can actually have that impact. So I think it's you know, the expectation is high, which is good, but I think we hopefully have the right team to be able to execute against it as well.
Yeah, that's great. And can you touch on more of your business model? How are you doing like a RaaS model? Are people, as you mentioned, buying the robots and then paying you a SaaS fee, or how does it work?
Yeah, exactly. So we do robotics as a service. So we say, look, customer, our pitch is simple. We say, okay, look, customer, what's your biggest pain point? My biggest pain point is that I cannot hire people. Okay, well, we can help you fill that role. How much are you paying right now per like station, right? Okay, well, that's X dollars. We're going to charge you something less than X. It's certainly not going to be more than X, at least for now. We're going to charge you something less than X on a yearly basis. You're going to pay it to us either monthly or annually. And for that, we're going to give you a human equivalent. And our job is to give you that, technically, our job is to give you that human equivalent, something that can kind of feel like a one-to-one equivalent so that you can actually increase your revenue. So really for our ROI, we're not trying to save them money. We're not trying to because saving them money is okay. It's an okay pitch. But really the best pitch is I'm just going to make you more money. I'm going to make you revenue. And that's been really successful for us. The other thing we kind of tell our customers is we're going to help you with yield, which, as I mentioned, is 40 to 50% of their COGS is food costs. So if I can help with yield and I can make more revenue because they don't have enough people to meet demand basically from a supply side, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. So I think it makes the sale not easy, but more tractable than saying, hey, I need $500,000 for you to even get started here.
Right.
With a CapEx solution.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes total sense. It's all about positioning it, right? You're selling the benefit straight up.
Yeah.
So we touched a few times here on the team and everything like that, how important that is. And obviously behind every successful startup is a strong team. What qualities do you look for in your hires and how do you help, once you've got them in there, foster innovation within the company?
Yeah, it's a good question. What do I look for? I think I look for a few things. I think one of the biggest things I look for is a history of prior success.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I mean by that? I think generally at an early stage company, I want somebody who's basically done the job before, right? So if I'm hiring a supply chain manager, well, I want somebody who's essentially been a supply chain manager at a previous kind of relatively small company, not at Apple, not at Google, a relatively small company, and they've been successful. And certainly you get that from the interview, but you can honestly get some of that, like inklings of it, from a resume as well. So that's one that definitely, if I'm looking for a senior robotics engineer, just for example, I'm going to look for other people who, somebody who's been a senior robotics engineer at a good firm that I respect. Ideally, they've productionized, they've shipped something, and probably they've been there 3 or 4 years. I mean, that's like a perfect candidate for me. So I think history of prior success is really important for me. I definitely care about smartness, because I think just raw intelligence, because I think at an early stage company, we might pivot, we might change. I mean, things are going to change. So I just want smart people in the room because you can generally figure things out. And then of course, those 3 things you can kind of figure out early in the process. But then of course, hard work is really important. I think just raw grittiness is really important. These are some of the few things I look for. Obviously there's more, I don't want somebody who's super jumpy and things like that. But these are some of the key things I look for, prior success, raw intelligence, hard work. I think those 3 components, if you have those, you can be successful. Definitely. I think when you're here at the company, I think fostering innovation is actually a lot harder than I think a lot of people think. What I mean by that is in an early stage startup, you're against the clock, right? You're going to run money. So it's not like you have infinite money. So this idea of do whatever you want to do, it's kind of hard, right? Because you need to ship stuff. You have deadlines, and if you don't meet those deadlines, your customer's going to fire you. You're not going to get a customer. You're going to run out of money. So it's actually quite hard to be super innovative while also getting a lot of stuff done. So I think my solution to this is a couple ideas. One is keep the team as small as possible for as long as you can. I think that's a little bit counterintuitive because a lot of people in Silicon Valley, there's a sexiness to having big startups and big companies with hundreds of employees and raise hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's really hard to innovate the bigger you get, honestly. So I think a small team of 3 or 4 people, less than 10 people, the 2 pizza team that Bezos always talks about. I think that's really clever because you can actually think. You actually have time to think before you scale the team really big. So I think that's part 1.
Yeah.
I think part 2 is the way we have done this that I think has worked fairly well is sales really works very closely with product, which is usually the CEO, because you don't have a product manager just early. to really define a clear stack ranked roadmap. And the stack ranking is really important. So in other words, like you say, look, this is what's important, like the what, right? But then the how and maybe when, like the when as well, you kind of define that. But then you let the engineering team really focus on the how. You give them creativity within the what. So we need to build this feature for this reason, for this customer. It's going to unlock more revenue. That, you as a CEO work with the sales team to do, but then you give flexibility around the how. I think broadly that's worked well, but honestly, it's not easy. And I think anyone who thinks like creating like this, like we all read about like, oh yeah, Steve Jobs created this very innovative culture at Apple and at Pixar. Like it's incredible, but that's why it's so. The reason it's so great is because it's so hard.
Yeah. So true. So I'm glad you said that. I'm really glad you said that, because a lot of people, they want to like either move from a big company to a smaller company or a startup because they think it's going to be a lot more R&D focused or innovative and stuff like that, and they forget that it is crunch time. You have to deliver, otherwise things are gonna your runway runs out real quick. And
you can't have 20% time, right?
No, yeah, exactly. You're not going to get that here.
Yes.
But it's also, I think it's important to stay on top of industry trends and technological advancements. But the reality is, it is tough. It's tougher to do when you are working flat out for deadlines and milestones. So.
I think there's a lot of talk about like, do you learn from like the customer or do you learn from your competitors, right? So like, I think a lot of innovation is very simply building a really clever solution to a problem the customer has. But the key thing that a lot of people miss is that second part, the problem the customer has. So we honestly don't really think about competitors very much. It's really just like solving customer problems and solving them in a way that's scalable, right? Like the dispenser example I gave, that might solve a customer problem, but it's not very scalable. And as soon as they change their menu, it's not going to work anymore. So I think like innovation kind of comes naturally in a startup because like you're building something new for a market, and maybe you're innovating the technology access, maybe you're innovating on the market access, maybe you're doing both technology and market. But I think like just maniacally focus on the customer, like what's the customer pain points? And I think that's lost a little bit. I think a lot of people just want to like build stuff, or they just want to code all day, but like they don't want to just like get on a plane and go talk to the customer. And that's really what's important, I think.
Yeah, it's so important. You've got to get out there. You've got to be out there in the field. All right, before we wrap up, finally, thank you again for all of this. I know we're almost at time, but where do you see the future of robotics in the food industry going, and what role do you see Chef Robotics playing in shaping that future?
Yeah, I think it's super exciting. I mean, I think like, coming back to the customer, like the pain point is super visceral. I mean, the BLS, the Bureau for Labor Statistics, just put out this report saying the food industry is the number one biggest labor shortage in the US. Like it's the biggest. And, the customers are asking for the product. So I think that the pain point is there. The technology is tractable. I think a lot of people are going after these like super cool as in like technically hard use cases, like autonomous vehicles and stuff like that, bin picking and warehouses. I mean, these are cool, but they're really tough. So I think I'm really excited about showing the world, hey, look, guys, like there's this really exciting market. Customers really desperately need the solution. And the technology is actually, it's not easy by any means, but like, it's not 20 years away or 10 years away. It's like, it's here on the horizon. So I hope that we can like inspire the next generation of people to be like, look, like let's do it, right? Let's like do AI and robotics. Let's ship robots, and hopefully we can do that in the food industry as well. So
awesome.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah, so am I. But look, thank you again so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate that. And thank you for sharing your insights and your experiences. Where can the listeners follow you, Chef Robotics, and keep up to date with all of your progress?
Yeah, I'm at Rajat Bhageria on Twitter, LinkedIn, and then Chef is at Chef Robotics, probably on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Those are the two main sources.
Perfect. All right, great. Thank you again. This was awesome.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate having me.